The beast was a thing of nightmare and shadow, a creature of snapped bone and torn sinew. They called him Noctis, a name whispered in the dark corners of the citadel, a name that tasted of blood and fear. He was the Alpha King's monster, his untamable rage given form a massive black wolf that had crippled three handlers and killed a fourth. The fourth handler's blood was still wet on the stone when King Riker Blackthorn arrived at the kennel entrance. He stood in the torchlight, tall and utterly still, his face carved from the same black granite as his fortress. His eyes, burning gold, even in human form, swept over the carnage without a flicker of emotion. The handler's body lay twisted at an unnatural angle, his neck broken clean. The other guards stood back, faces pale, spears trembling in their hands. Riker said nothing. He did not need to. He felt everything the wolf felt, every surge of rage, every pulse of feral hunger. The bond between king and beast was absolute. They were one soul split across two forms, and for centuries that soul had known nothing but torment. He turned and walked away, his boots echoing on the stone. Behind the iron gate, deep in the cavern's darkness, 2 points of yellow light blazed. A low growl rumbled through the rock, a sound so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself. The guards flinched. Riker did not look back. Let the monster rage. He had done so for lifetimes. What was one more death? Stonehaven Citadel rose from the wilderness like a black fang, a fortress of volcanic rock perched on the edge of a cliff that dropped 500 feet to the churning Pacific below. It sat deep in the Montana borderlands where the Rockies met the coastal rainforest, a place of perpetual mist and ancient trees. The citadel was not built for comfort. It was built to withstand sieges, to endure winter storms that could tear the roof from lesser structures, to house a king who needed no warmth. The Northern Rockies pack had ruled this territory for 1,000 years, and Riker Blackthorn had ruled the pack for 300 of them. He was Alpha King's supreme leader, the strongest wolf in 100 generations. His power was absolute. His word was law, and his heart was a tomb. 3 months earlier, in 200 miles to the south, in a manor house built on the gentler slopes of the Cascade Range foothills, a girl sat by a window and dreamed of the sea. Her name was Maren Thornfield, and she had never walked a day in her life. The room was her world. 4 walls, a narrow bed, a window that looked out over a muddy courtyard where her father's guards drilled and her stepsister's horses were groomed to gleaming perfection. Marin's world was small, but her mind was vast. In her lap lay an atlas old and worn, its pages soft as cloth from years of handling. She traced the jagged coastline of the Dragon's Tooth Peninsula, with one finger following the route a ship might take from the port of Greywater to the distant Mist Isles. She could not walk, but in her mind she could sail. The door opened without a knock. It never did anymore. Marin did not look up. "Still here, little spider." The voice was silk and poison. Seraphina Thornfield swept into the room like a hunting cat, all grace and hidden claws. She was 25, 5 years older than Marin, and beautiful in the way a knife was beautiful. Her hair was pale gold, her eyes ice blue, her gown the color of fresh cream. She moved to the window and looked out with the air of someone surveying her domain. Marin kept her eyes on her book. Silence was her only shield. Words only gave Seraphina ammunition. "It's almost time for the tithe." Seraphina continued, trailing one perfect finger along the windowsill. "The Alpha King's men will be here within the week. Father is preparing the caravan. Furs, timber, iron. The tribute of a loyal vassal." She paused, turning to look at Marin with a small, cruel smile. "We can't have you dragging your useless body around where they can see you. It would reflect poorly on the house." Marin said nothing. Her eyes remained fixed on the map on the safe blue expanse of the Iron Sea. Seraphina's smile widened. "I've been thinking. The Alpha King is said to be magnificent. Cold, of course. Ruthless, but powerful. A true king needs a true queen, don't you think? Someone whole, someone worthy." She crossed the room and leaned down, her perfume cloying and thick. Someone who can stand beside him, not sit in a chair like broken furniture. Marin's fingers tightened on the edge of her atlas. She did not rise to the bait. She had learned over 22 years of her stepsister's cruelty that reaction was what Seraphina craved. Silence starved her. Seraphina straightened, irritation flickering across her perfect features. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "One of his guards was injured last year. Father had to send 2 of his best men as replacement levies. A waste." Her eyes gleamed. "But what if one sent something different, a gesture of loyalty, of justice? What do you think, little spider? What does justice look like?" A cold dread seeped into Marin's bones. She knew that look. It was the look Seraphina got before she did something truly cruel. The next day, the captain of Lord Thornfield's guard came to Marin's room. He would not meet her eyes. He said there had been an incident. A valuable tapestry, a gift meant for the Alphaking himself, had been found slashed to ribbons in the Great Hall. Her knife, the small silver blade she used for cutting the pages of new books, had been found lying beside the ruined silk. It was a lie. Marin had not left her room in 3 days. But her father accepted the story without question. It was the excuse he had been waiting for her entire life. Lord Thornfield came to her room that evening. He did not sit. He stood over her, his face mottled with rage that had nothing to do with a tapestry and everything to do with the daughter who had been born wrong. "You are a disgrace to this house," he hissed. His voice shook not with grief, but with fury. He did not see a daughter. He saw a flawed product, a stain on his reputation. "You will be sent to Stonehaven citadel, not as a lady but as a penitent. You will work off your debt of shame. Let the Alphaking see that House Thornfield knows how to punish its own." Behind him, Seraphina stood in the doorway. Her face was calm, serene, almost gentle, but her eyes held a glitter of triumph. She had won. She had scrubbed the stain of her broken sister from the family name, and in her twisted mind, she had performed an act of loyalty to the king she idolized. Marin was put on a cart the next morning, like a sack of grain. No farewells, no servants to see her off. Just the driver and 2 guards who would not speak to her. She held her atlas tight against her chest, the only thing she had been allowed to keep, and stared at the gray autumn sky. She did not cry. Tears were for people who had something to lose. The road north was rough, winding through forests of cedar and Douglas fir, climbing into the mountains where the air grew thin and cold. It took 3 days to reach Stonehaven. 3 days of silence, of cold rations, of lying in the back of the cart and watching the clouds drift past. On the second night, they camped in a clearing, and Marin heard the guards talking in low voices by the fire. "Poor girl," one muttered, "sent to tend the shadow wolf. That's a death sentence if I ever heard one." "Aye," the other replied. "They say the beast killed its 4th handler just last week. Tore his neck clean through. The king keeps it locked in the deep caverns. Won't let anyone near it without chains and whips. And they're sending crippled girl to feed it." A pause, then Lord Thornfield knows what he's doing. It's a punishment, not a posting. Marin lay very still in the cart bed, staring up at the stars. The shadow wolf, Noctis. She had heard the name whispered in her father's hall, spoken with fear and something close to reverence. The Alphaking's monster, a creature of legend and nightmare. They were sending her to die. On the morning of the 3rd day, the forest opened up and Stonehaven appeared. It was not a castle. It was a spike of black rock jutting out of the wilderness like a dagger aimed at the sky. The citadel had been carved directly from a volcanic plug, its walls sheer and glassy, its towers narrow and sharp. Below it, the land dropped away into a gorge where the Pacific crashed against the cliffs in an endless roar. Mist rose from the chasm, cold and salt-laden, wrapping the fortress in a permanent shroud. Marin felt the temperature drop as they crossed the final ridge. The air here was different. It smelled of stone and brine and something else. Something wild and musky that made the hairs on her arms stand up. This was not a place meant for living. It was a place built to endure. The cart rolled through the outer gates and into the lower bailey. Guards in black leather and steel moved past without a glance. Servants hurried across the cobblestones, their faces hard and grim. No one looked at her. She was less than invisible. She was refuse. The driver pulled the cart to a stop and climbed down without a word. He and the guards lifted her from the bedchair and set her on the cold flagstones. Then they turned and left their boots echoing away into the maze of courtyards and stairways. Marin sat alone in the middle of the bailey, clutching her atlas, and waited. Hours passed. The cold seeped through her thin cloak and settled in her bones. The damp autumn air turned her breath to fog. People came and went, their eyes sliding over her as if she were a piece of furniture left out in the rain. Once a group of servants hurried past carrying linens, and one of them nearly tripped over her chair. The woman cursed and kicked the wheel before hurrying on. No one stopped. No one asked if she needed help. No one cared. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the bailey, when a woman finally stopped before her. She was tall and stern, with a face like a hawk, and iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe nod. She wore the gray livery of the Citadel's senior staff, and her eyes were the color of winter ice. "You're the one from Lord Thornfield," the woman said. It was not a question. Her gaze swept over Marin's crumpled form, lingering on her legs with open distaste. The vandal. Marin could only knot her throat tight. "My name is Brenna Stone. I am the housekeeper of Stonehaven." The woman's voice was clipped, efficient. The king has decreed that you will serve in the kennels. You will tend to the beast. A pause. A flicker of something that might have been cruel satisfaction crossed Brenna's face. Tend to Noctis, the shadow wolf. Perhaps he'll find a use for your bones if nothing else. A ripple of real fear, cold and sharp, finally pierced Marin's numbness. The kennels. The beast. She had heard the whispers, but hearing it spoken aloud, official and final, made it real. This was not exile. It was execution. Two guards appeared at Brenna's gesture. They were young, broad-shouldered, and they would not meet Marin's eyes. One of them muttered something that might have been an apology as they lifted her chair. Then they carried her away from the bailey down a series of winding stone stairs that descended into the heart of the mountain. The air grew colder as they went deeper. The sounds of the citadel above faded, replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the drip of water and the distant rhythmic crash of waves against rock far below. The walls here were rough-hewn, ancient, carved from the volcanic stone by hands long dead. Torches burned in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows that seemed alive. They descended for what felt like an eternity. Down and down, past storerooms and armories, past cisterns and wine cellars, past the normal infrastructure of a fortress, until they reached a level that felt forgotten, abandoned. At the bottom of the final stairway was a natural cavern, vast and echoing. The ceiling disappeared into darkness. The floor was smooth black stone worn slick by centuries of water, and at the far end, barely visible in the torchlight, was an iron gate. The bars were as thick as a man's arm. The lock was the size of a fist. Beyond the gate, there was only darkness. The guards set Marin down just outside the gate and backed away quickly. One of them pointed to a bucket filled with bloody chunks of raw meat. Another bucket held water. "Food's there, water's there," the guard said, his voice rough with discomfort. "Slide it through the slot at the bottom. Pray to the old gods, he's not hungry for more than mutton." Then they were gone. Their footsteps echoed away up the stairs, fading into silence. Marin was alone with the monster. For a long moment, she simply sat breathing, the cold, damp air, listening to the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness. Her heart hammered in her chest. Her hands were shaking. Then from the depths of the cavern beyond the gate, two points of yellow light ignited in the darkness. They floated there, unblinking, burning with a cold, intelligent fire. Eyes. Not human. Not quite animal. Something in between, something ancient and utterly feral. A low growl rumbled through the stone. It was so deep she felt it in her chest, a vibration that rattled her very bones. It was the sound a landslide might make, or an earthquake. The sound of the earth itself warning you to run. This was it, the end of her worthless life. She was a broken toy thrown into the monster's cage, a punishment disguised as duty. Her father had finally found a way to be rid of her without the shame of simply casting her out. And in that moment, sitting alone in the darkness with death watching her from beyond the bars, a strange sort of peace settled over Marin. She had nothing left to lose. Fear was a luxury for people who had hope. Slowly, painfully, she lowered herself from her worn wooden chair to the cold stone floor. She dragged her body forward, her arms trembling with the effort, until she was sitting directly before the iron gate. The bars were cold beneath her hands. She did not try to push the food through. She did not cower or plead. She simply sat her back against the damp rock and looked into the darkness where those burning eyes waited. "Hello," she whispered. Her voice was barely a breath, but it seemed to fill the cavern. "My name is Marin." The growling stopped. The yellow eyes blinked. Once, twice. Marin took a shaking breath. Her voice gained a sliver of strength. "They sent me here to die, I think." She looked down at her useless legs, then back at the eyes. "But they've been trying to get rid of me my whole life, so you'll have to get in line." A huff of air, hot and smelling of blood and raw meat, gusted from the darkness. She heard movement, the scrape of claws on stone. A massive shape shifted in the shadows. The beast took a step forward into the dim light cast by the torches behind her. And Marin forgot to breathe. He was larger than any wolf she had ever read about, larger than seemed possible. His shoulders stood level with her head even as she sat. His fur was the color of a starless midnight, so black it seemed to absorb the light. His muscles coiled, like thick ropes beneath his skin, shifting with every careful step. Scars crisscrossed his muzzle and flanks, some old and silver, some fresh and pink. His teeth, visible behind curled lips, were as long as her fingers. He was a creature of pure primal power, a weapon honed by time into something perfect and terrible. But it was his eyes that held her. Up close, they were not just yellow, they were gold molten and burning, filled with an intelligence that was achingly, devastatingly human. He stopped, just shy of the bars, his great head lowered, those burning eyes fixed on her. He was not just a monster, he was magnificent. And he was profoundly, utterly alone. The loneliness poured off him in waves, a bone-deep, aching isolation that Marin recognized as if it were her own. She saw it in the way he held himself tense and guarded. She saw it in the scars that spoke of handlers with whips and chains. She saw it in eyes that had not known gentleness in lifetimes. He was a prisoner just like her, locked away, forgotten, punished for something he could not change. She did not see a monster. She saw a kindred spirit. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The wolf's ears, which had been pinned flat against his skull, twitched. "I'm sorry they've kept you down here. I'm sorry you're alone." The wolf did not move. He simply watched her, his head cocked slightly to one side. Marin shifted, settling herself more comfortably against the stone. She pulled her atlas from where it had fallen beside her and opened it to a random page. The coastline of the northern archipelago, all jagged cliffs and hidden coves. "I've never seen the ocean," she said quietly. "Not in person, but I've read about it, about ships that sail for months without touching land, about storms that can swallow a fleet whole, about islands where no one has ever set foot." She traced a finger along a dotted line that marked a trade route. "When I was little, I used to imagine I was on one of those ships. I'd close my eyes and feel the deck roll beneath me. I'd smell the salt air. I'd hear the crew singing as they worked the rigging." The wolf sank down onto his haunches, his eyes never leaving her face. "My father didn't like that," Marin continued. Her voice was soft, almost dreamy. "He said it was foolish, that I should accept what I am, that dreaming only made things worse." She looked up from the book, meeting those golden eyes. "But what else was I supposed to do? If I couldn't dream, I had nothing." A sound came from the wolf's throat. Not a growl, something softer, a low questioning whine. Marin felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them away. "My stepsister is beautiful. Perfect. She has everything. Our father's love, the respect of the household, a future. And me, I'm the stain on the family name. The mistake that should have been corrected." She closed the book, gently running her hand over the worn leather cover. "She's the one who put me here. She destroyed something valuable and made sure I'd take the blame. And it worked, because no one would ever believe that perfect Serafina could do something cruel." The wolf's ears were fully forward now, pricked and attentive. He had shifted closer to the bars, close enough that Marin could see the individual whiskers on his muzzle, the flecks of amber in his golden eyes. "I bet you understand," she said, "being blamed for things, being punished for what you are not, what you've done." The wolf huffed again, and this time it sounded almost like agreement. They stayed that way for hours. Marin talked, pouring out all the words she had held inside for a lifetime. She told the wolf about her mother, who had died when Marin was small, who had sung sea shanties and told stories of sailors and storms. She told him about her father's cold ambition, about Serafina's casual cruelty, about the loneliness of being invisible in your own home. She told him about the constellations she could see from her window, the patterns of stars that guided ships across the trackless ocean. She told him about the books she'd read, the maps she'd memorized, the places she would never see. And the wolf listened. He did not pace or snarl. He simply lay there, his massive body pressed against the bars, as close to her as he could get, his head resting on his paws, his eyes soft and focused entirely on her. For the first time in her life, Marin felt truly seen. Not pitied, not dismissed, not hated, just seen. When her voice finally grew hoarse and the torches burned low, she fell silent. The cavern was quiet except for the distant drip of water and the wolf's slow, steady breathing. "Thank you," Marin whispered, "for listening." The wolf's tail, a thick, powerful appendage that had been lying still behind him, gave a single small thump against the stone. It was such a simple thing, such a tiny gesture. But Marin's breath caught in her throat. The wolf's eyes met hers, and for a heartbeat, she could have sworn she saw something beyond animal instinct looking back at her. Something vast and old and desperately grateful. Then exhaustion crashed over her like a wave. She had not slept properly in days, and the emotional toll of everything that had happened finally caught up with her. Her eyes grew heavy. "I'm sorry," she murmured, slumping against the wall. "I'm so tired." The wolf did not move. He remained pressed against the bars, a silent guardian in the darkness. Marin's eyes closed. Within moments she was asleep, her breathing slow and even, her hand still resting on the atlas in her lap. High above in the tallest tower of Stonehaven citadel, Riker Blackthorn stood at a window and stared out at the dark forest below. He could feel the dawn approaching, could sense the shift in the air that came with the turning of night to day. but he barely noticed. His entire awareness was focused on the bond, the invisible thread that connected him to the beast locked deep beneath the mountain. For lifetimes, that bond had been a torment. A constant stream of rage and pain and feral hunger, an echo of his own guilt, amplified and reflected back at him. The wolf was everything he had locked away, everything he could not allow himself to feel. It was his punishment and his prison. But tonight something had changed. The rage was gone. The snarling, restless energy that had defined the beast for so long had dissolved into something he had never felt before. Peace. Riker's hands tightened on the windowsill. He could feel it through the bond, as clear as if he were standing in that cavern himself. The wolf was calm, not drugged, not chained, not beaten into submission. Simply calm, resting, content. And beneath that calm, he felt something else. A warmth, a gentle presence that soothed the jagged edges of his own fractured soul. The girl. He had dismissed her when the report came in, a crippled daughter sent as a penitent assigned to the kennels. He had not cared. People came and went from Stonehaven. Most did not last long. The citadel was harsh, and he was harsher. But she had not died. The wolf had not killed her. And now, through the bond, Riker could feel what the beast felt. Curiosity, interest, and something that felt dangerously close to affection. His jaw tightened. This was wrong. The wolf was not meant to be tamed. It was rage given a form, guilt made flesh. It was the part of him that deserved to suffer the part that had failed when it mattered most. 300 years ago, he had stood on a battlefield and hesitated. He had been young, newly crowned, powerful beyond measure. And when the moment came to act, when the enemy had surrounded a village of innocents, he had frozen. Not out of cowardice, but out of fear of his own strength. He had been afraid of what he might become if he unleashed his full power. So he had hesitated. And the village had burned. Women and children had died screaming while he stood paralyzed by his own doubt. He had locked his wolf away that day, chained it in the deepest dungeon of his mind, and sealed it behind walls of iron guilt. Over the years, it had grown into something monstrous, something that reflected his self-loathing back at him tenfold. It was meant to suffer. He was meant to suffer. And now this broken girl, this worthless cast-off, had walked into his fortress and done the impossible. She had made his monster wag its tail. Riker's breath came sharp and fast. He felt something unfamiliar coiling in his gut, something he had not allowed himself to feel in lifetimes. Hope. And it terrified him, because hope meant possibility. It meant change. It meant the walls he had built around his dead heart might not be as impenetrable as he had believed. He turned away from the window, his face a mask of cold fury. No, he would not allow this. The girl was a variable he had not accounted for, a crack in the foundation of his carefully constructed purgatory. He should order her removed, send her to scrub floors in the upper citadel where she belonged, far away from the wolf. Let things return to the way they were meant to be. But even as the thought formed, he felt the bond pulse with that strange, gentle warmth. Felt the wolf's contentment, the first true rest the creature had known in memory. Felt his own mind grow quiet for the first time and longer than he could remember. Riker stood frozen in the center of his solar, caught between the urge to destroy this fragile new thing and the desperate, aching need to protect it. In the end, he did nothing. He simply stood there as dawn broke over the mountains, as light spilled across the stone floor, as the citadel began to stir with the sounds of another day. And deep below, in the forgotten cavern at the heart of the mountain, a broken girl slept peacefully beside a monster's cage, and the monster kept watch over her like a guardian, and for the first time in ages, neither of them was alone. The days turned into a week, and the week stretched into something that felt almost like routine, almost like peace. Marin woke each morning in the cavern, her body stiff from sleeping on stone, her muscles aching from the cold. But she woke to golden eyes watching over her, to the steady rhythm of Noctis's breathing, and somehow the pain seemed bearable. She began each day by talking to him while she worked. Her arms had grown stronger from dragging herself across the cavern floor, from pulling buckets of clean water down the long stairs, from wielding the heavy broom that she used to sweep the stones clean. The guards had stopped coming down entirely. They left her supplies at the top of the stairway, buckets of meat and water and firewood, for the small brazier that provided her only warmth. She did not mind. Their absence meant that she and Noctis could exist in their own small world, but untouched by the cruelty above. She cleaned his side of the cavern as best she could, pushing refuse through the bars with the broom handle, washing the stones with bucket after bucket of water until her arms trembled. Noctis would watch her work, his great head resting on his paws, his eyes tracking her every movement. When the meat arrived, she would pick through the bucket with her bare hands, selecting the best pieces the ones with the least gristle and the most flesh. These she would slide through the slot at the bottom of the gate one piece at a time, and Noctis would take them from her fingers with a delicacy that seemed impossible for a creature with jaws that could snap bone. The guards' scraps, the ones they left in the bucket for him, sat untouched. He would not eat them. He ate only what she offered, only what passed through her hands. Brenna Stone noticed within 3 days. The stern housekeeper appeared at the top of the stairs one morning, her face tight with disapproval. "The beast refuses the food we provide," she said, her voice echoing down into the cavern. "He eats only from you. This is unnatural." Marin looked up from where she sat by the gate, her hands covered in blood from preparing Noctis's meal. "Perhaps he simply prefers kindness to cruelty." Brenna's eyes narrowed. "Watch your tongue, girl. You are here as a punishment, not a guest. The king will hear of this. Mark my words." She turned and left her footsteps sharp and angry on the stone. Marin looked at Noctis, who had risen to his feet, his hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest as he stared up the stairs where Brenna had disappeared. "It's all right," Marin whispered. "She can't hurt us down here." But she was wrong. Brenna could do worse than hurt them. She could report to the king. High above in the private council chamber adjacent to his solar Riker, Blackthorn listened to his housekeeper's report with a face carved from stone. "The creature has not eaten our provisions in 7 days, Your Majesty," Brenna said, standing rigidly before his desk. "It consumes only what the girl provides. She has enchanted it somehow, bewitched it. This is dark magic, sire. It must be." Riker said nothing. His fingers were steepled before him, his golden eyes fixed on some point past Brenna's shoulder. Inside, his mind was a storm. He knew the truth. There was no magic, no enchantment. The bond told him everything. The wolf ate from Marin's hands because her touch carried something the creature had been starved of for ages. Compassion, care, the simple recognition that he was more than a monster to be feared. "The girl is a witch," Brenna continued, her voice gaining confidence from his silence. "She has enslaved the Shadow Wolf. She will use it against you, against the pack. You must remove her, Your Majesty, before it is too late." Riker's eyes finally moved to Brenna's face. The housekeeper took an involuntary step back. She had served him for 50 years, and she knew that look. It was the look that preceded banishment, or worse. "The wolf cannot be enchanted," Riker said, his voice soft and all the more dangerous for it. "It is my soul-given form. What it feels, I feel. There is no magic. There is only a girl who treats a suffering creature with the decency that you and every other member of this household have failed to provide." Brenna's mouth opened, then closed. Her face flushed red. "She stays," Riker continued. "The beast is calm for the first time in living memory. That is all that matters. You will ensure she has everything she needs. Better meat, clean linens, warmer clothes. Am I understood?" "Yes, Your Majesty." Brenna's voice was strangled. "And Brenna," Riker's eyes burned gold, "if I hear that you have spoken to her with anything less than respect, you will find yourself on the first ship to the mainland with nothing but the clothes on your back. Are we clear, Crystal, Your Majesty?" "Then go." Brenna fled. Riker sat alone in his chamber, his hands gripping the arms of his chair until the wood creaked. He should not care. He should not let this broken girl affect him. She was nothing, a criminal sent to serve her sentence, a temporary inconvenience in the eternal grinding monotony of his existence. But through the bond, he could feel what Noctis felt, and what the wolf felt was changing him. For the first time in memory, the constant background roar of rage and guilt had quieted. In its place was something gentle, something warm. When the girl spoke to the wolf, when she hummed old sailing songs while she worked, when she read to him from that worn atlas, Riker felt peace seep into his own frozen heart. And with the peace came something far more dangerous. Awareness. He could taste food again. Not just consume it mechanically, but actually taste it. The wine he drank with dinner had notes of oak and cherry. The venison was rich and gamey. The bread was warm and yeasty. He could feel the fire's heat on his skin, could smell the pine logs burning in the hearth. He could hear music. The Citadel's bard played in the great hall most evenings, and for ages Riker had heard nothing but noise. Now he heard melody, harmony, the aching beauty of a well-played lute. The girl was thawing him, and he did not know whether to thank her or destroy her for it. Because with feeling came memory, and the memories were sharp as knives. That night he went down to the kennels. He told himself it was to assess the situation, to see for himself what the girl was doing. But it was a lie. He went because he needed to understand, needed to see her with his own eyes. He moved through the shadows like a ghost, his footsteps making no sound on the stone. The bond guided him, showing him where the wolf was, where she was. He stopped in the archway at the top of the final stairway and looked down into the cavern below. The girl had dragged a pile of old grain sacks near the gate and fashioned them into a rough bed. She lay curled on her side, her dark hair spilling across the burlap, her atlas open in her lap. One hand rested against the bars. On the other side of the gate, Noctis lay pressed as close to the iron as he could get, his massive body stretched out, his head near her hand. His breathing was slow and even. His eyes were closed. He was sleeping. Truly sleeping, not the restless, tormented half-doze that had been his only rest for ages. And as Riker watched, the wolf's tail gave a soft thump against the stone. Once, twice. A sleepy, contented rhythm. Riker's breath stopped in his throat. In all his long years, he had never seen that tail move, except in preparation for violence. It was a weapon used for balance during a lunge for delivering a killing blow. It had never wagged, never expressed anything but rage until now. The sight hit him like a physical blow. His knees went weak, his vision blurred. This impossible, broken girl had done what armies could not. She had given his soul a moment of simple joy, and Riker knew with a certainty that chilled him to his core that she would be the end of him. He turned and fled back up the stairs, his heart pounding, his mind reeling. He did not sleep that night. He stood at his window and stared out at the darkness and felt the foundations of his carefully constructed hell beginning to crack. The next morning, fresh venison arrived at the top of the kennel stairs. Not the usual scraps and gristle, but prime cuts, still bleeding, the kind reserved for the king's own table. With it came thick wool blankets, a fur-lined cloak, and clean water in a proper pitcher instead of a bucket. Maren stared at the offerings in confusion. She looked up the stairs, half expecting to see someone watching, but there was only darkness. "I think," she said slowly to Noctis, who had risen to investigate the new sense. "Someone is looking out for us." The wolf's ears pricked forward. His eyes, so intelligent and knowing, seemed to gleam with something that might have been amusement. Marin did not know that high above a king stood in his solar and told himself lies about keeping the beast's strength up. Did not know that Riker Blackthorn was feeding her, caring for her, protecting her, even as he tried to convince himself he felt nothing. The second week passed, then the third. A routine established itself, fragile but real. Marin would wake, would clean, would prepare Noctis's meals with careful attention. She would talk to him for hours, telling him stories from her books, describing the places she had never seen. The mist isles where they said the fog never lifted and ships disappeared into legend. The Dragon's Teeth, the chain of volcanic islands, where the water boiled and steam rose in great plumes. The frozen fjords of the far north where ice shelves calved into the sea with sounds like thunder. And Noctis would listen, his eyes soft, his massive body relaxed. In the afternoons when exhaustion forced her to rest, Marin would lean against the bars and close her eyes, and sometimes she would sing. Old songs her mother had taught her, sailor shanties about storms and safe harbors and the long journey home. Her voice was small in the vast cavern, thin and reedy, but it was steady, and Noctis would rest his great head near her close enough that she could feel his breath on her skin, and the loneliness that had defined both their lives would recede just a little. She began to notice something strange. When she placed her hand against the bars, when she was close enough to the gate that only iron separated them, she could feel something. A warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. A presence vast and ancient and profoundly sad that seemed to wrap around her like invisible arms. It felt like being seen, being known, being understood in a way she had never experienced. She did not know that what she felt was the bond leaking through the connection between wolf and girl, allowing her a glimpse of the soul that lived inside the beast. She did not know that in his tower, Riker felt her presence just as clearly, felt her loneliness echo his own, felt her gentle strength seeping into the cracks of his frozen heart. They were connecting, the three of them, bound together by invisible threads that grew stronger each day. The girl, the wolf, and the king who watched from the shadows and felt his carefully maintained hell beginning to crumble. On the 21st day, a storm rolled in from the Pacific. It came without warning, a black wall of clouds that devoured the sky and turned afternoon into midnight. Thunder cracked like the world breaking apart. Lightning turned the darkness into stark, terrifying snapshots of reality. Rain hammered against the citadel's stone walls, driven by winds that howled like the damned. In the cavern, Noctis went mad. Marin had never seen him like this. He paced the length of his prison, his claws scraping gouges in the stone, his lips pulled back from his fangs in a constant snarl. His eyes were wild, rolling white with panic. He threw himself against the walls, against the bars, his massive body shaking with a terror that was primal and overwhelming. The sound he made was worse than any growl. It was a whimpering, keening wail, a noise so full of pain and fear that it shattered Marin's heart. Noctis. She dragged herself to the gate, her hands gripping the cold iron. Noctis, it's all right. It's just a storm. But he could not hear her. He was lost, trapped in some memory that the thunder had awakened, some nightmare that time had not dulled. Above in his solar, Riker collapsed to his knees, one hand pressed against his chest. The bond was screaming. The wolf's terror crashed over him in waves, dragging him down into a memory he had spent ages trying to forget. The village. The night of fire and blood. There had been a storm that night, too. Thunder had rolled across the battlefield, and lightning had illuminated the burning homes. The screams of the dying had been swallowed by the roar of the wind and the crack of thunder. He had stood frozen, a young king paralyzed by fear of his own power, and people had died because he had been too afraid to act. The guilt locked away for so long surged back with crushing force. Riker gasped for air, his vision blurring, his entire body shaking. In the cavern, Marin watched Noctis throw himself against the gate with such force that the iron bars groaned. She was terrified not of him, but for him. This was not rage, this was anguish, this was a soul in torment. Without thinking, she pulled herself as close to the bars as she could get, pressing herself against the cold metal. She reached her hands through, not quite touching him, but offering her presence, her warmth. "Shh," she whispered, her voice shaking but clear. "Shh, it's all right. It's just noise. It can't hurt you in here. I'm here. I won't leave you." Thunder crashed again so loud it shook dust from the ceiling. Noctis let out a howl that was more human than wolf, a sound of pure agony. And Marin began to sing. It was the same song her mother had sung to her during storms when she was small and frightened. A song about a ship finding its way home through a tempest, guided by the light of a single star. Her voice was small against the thunder, thin as a thread, but it was steady. Through the dark and through the gale. When the winds tear at the sail, there's a light that never fails, guiding sailors home. Though the waves may climb so high, though the storm obscures the sky, there's a star that will not die, calling sailors home. Noctis stopped his frantic pacing. His wild eyes found her. He stood trembling, his sides heaving, foam flecking his muzzle. Marin kept singing, her eyes locked on his. When the anchor finds the ground, when the harbor's finally found, when the ship is safely bound, we are finally home. The great wolf took a shaking step toward her, then another. His legs seemed barely able to hold his weight. "I'm here," Marin whispered between verses. "I'm right here, you're not alone." Noctis crawled the last few feet to the gate. He pressed himself against the bars, his massive body shaking, and rested his head as close to her hands as the iron would allow. Marin reached through her fingers, just barely able to touch the top of his head, to brush the soft fur between his ears. "Good," she breathed. "That's good. I've got you. The storm can't touch you. I won't let it." She kept singing soft and low as the thunder rolled overhead. And slowly, gradually, the trembling in Noctis's body subsided. His breathing steadied, his eyes still wide, with lingering fear focused on her face and held there like an anchor. In his solar, Riker felt the shift, felt the terror recede, pushed back by something warm and gentle and impossibly strong. The girl's voice, thin as a spider's silk, wrapped around his fractured soul and held it together. She was not calming the wolf. She was calming him. He pressed his forehead against the cold stone wall and let out a shaking breath. The memory of the burning village was still there, still sharp, but for the first time in ages, it did not consume him. It hurt, yes. It ached like an old wound, but it did not destroy him. Because somewhere below, a broken girl was singing to his broken soul, and her voice was telling him that he did not have to face the darkness alone. When the storm finally passed hours later, Marin was hoarse and exhausted. Noctis lay against the bars, his eyes half closed, his breathing slow and even. One of her hands rested on his head, her fingers buried in his thick fur. "I know you're scared," she whispered. "I get scared too, but we have each other now, and that has to count for something." The wolf's tail lying still behind him gave a single soft thump, then another, a slow, steady rhythm that spoke of gratitude and trust in something deeper than words could express. Marin's eyes filled with tears. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the bars, and Noctis shifted so that his great head rested against hers, with only the iron between them. "We're going to be all right," she said, though she did not know if she believed it. "Somehow we're going to be all right." In the tower above, Riker Blackthorn stood at his window and stared out at the clearing sky. His hands were shaking, His face was wet with tears he had not allowed himself to shed in ages. The girl had reached through the bars of his self-imposed prison and touched his soul. She had offered comfort where he had believed none existed. She had shown him that even the shattered could be made whole. And he knew with a certainty that was both terrible and wondrous that he could never let her go. 3 days later, Riker made a decision that would change everything. He found Brenna Stone in the main hall, overseeing the preparation for the coming midwinter feast. The annual gathering was 2 weeks away, and the citadel was already preparing for the influx of lesser lords and their households. Brenna, Riker said, his voice cutting through the noise of servants and workers. The housekeeper turned surprise flickering across her stern features. The king rarely sought her out directly. "Your Majesty," she bowed. "Prepare a room in the upper citadel, the east wing, something with a view of the mountains and a proper hearth." Brenna's eyes widened slightly. "For a guest, sire. For the girl in the kennels. She will be moved to the upper citadel. Today." Silence fell across the hall. Servants stopped their work, their eyes wide. Brenna looked as though she had been struck. "Your Majesty," she began carefully, "the girl is a penitent. She was sent here to serve to work off her debt. She is under my protection now." Riker interrupted, his voice cold as winter steel. "Anyone who harms her, anyone who speaks to her with disrespect, anyone who fails to provide her with anything she requires will answer to me personally. Am I understood?" Brenna's throat worked. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Good. See that it's done within the hour." He turned and strode away, leaving whispers and stunned silence in his wake. That afternoon, Marin was pulled from the cavern by 2 guards who would not meet her eyes. They carried her up the long stairs through corridors she had never seen to a room that overlooked the mountains and the forest below. It was warm. There was a fire in the hearth, a proper bed with clean linens, a window with glass instead of shutters. It was more than she had ever had, even in her father's house. But it was also a cage. The servants who brought her meals would not speak to her. The guards who stood outside her door would not acknowledge her. She was wheeled through the corridors once a day by silent attendants who pushed her chair as though it were an unpleasant chore. And the whispers followed her everywhere. The king's pet. Witch who enslaved the shadow. Unnatural creature. Marin heard them all. She saw the fear in the servants' eyes, the contempt in the guards' faces. She had been moved from one prison to another, this one gilded, but just as isolating. And she missed Noctis with an ache that was physical. She was allowed to visit the kennels once a day, but it was not the same. Guards accompanied her, now standing watch as though she might do something dangerous. She could not sleep by his side, could not spend hours talking to him, could not simply be. Noctis felt it too. When she was brought down, he would press against the bars, his eyes fixed on her face, and she could feel his confusion, his longing. Why had she left him? Why did she stay away? "I'm sorry," she would whisper, her hands on his face through the bars. "I'm so sorry, I didn't choose this." But an hour was all she was allowed before the guards would pull her away, and each separation felt like tearing off a piece of her soul. Riker had given her safety. He had given her comfort. But he had taken away the one thing that mattered. He had taken away her freedom. And in doing so, he had made her more of a prisoner than she had ever been before. High above in his tower, Riker felt the change through the bond. The peace that had settled over the wolf was fracturing, replaced by a restless anxiety. Noctis paced his cage at night, his eyes turned toward the stairs, waiting for a girl who would not come. And Riker felt his own isolation deepen. He had thought protecting her meant bringing her into the citadel, giving her a room, ensuring her safety. But he had forgotten that safety without freedom was just another cage. He had saved her from the kennels only to trap her in a different kind of prison. And the wolf, the beast that had finally known peace, was suffering for it. Riker stood at his window, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. He did not know how to fix this. Did not know how to give her what she needed without letting her get too close, without risking the walls he had built around his heart. So he did nothing. He watched from a distance as she was wheeled through his halls, her face expressionless, her eyes distant. He felt the bond pulse with longing and loss, and he told himself it was for the best, that she was better off away from the darkness that lived inside him, that keeping her at a distance was the kindest thing he could do. But late at night, when the citadel slept and he stood alone in his tower, he knew the truth. He was not protecting her. He was protecting himself, and it was destroying them both. The package arrived at Marin's door on the 7th day of her confinement in the upper citadel. A servant left it on the small table by her window, without a word, refusing to meet her eyes before hurrying away. Inside was her atlas, but it was no longer the broken, ruined thing that Seraphina had destroyed. The spine had been expertly rebound in supple leather, the color of aged wine. The torn pages had been carefully mended, each one pressed flat and reinforced. The cover had been tooled with an intricate pattern of waves and stars, the kind of craftsmanship that spoke of days of patient labor. Tucked inside the front cover was a note written in a sharp, angular hand. A promise kept. R. Marin's hands trembled as she ran her fingers over the restored binding. She opened it carefully, reverently, turning to the page that showed the northern archipelago. The tear that had split the Dragon's Teeth Islands in half had been mended so skillfully that she could barely see the seam. Someone had done this. Someone had taken her broken treasure and made it whole. The king. Riker Blackthorn, the cold tyrant who kept a monster in his dungeons, who ruled with absolute authority, who had never spoken a word to her beyond that single moment when he had gathered the torn pages from the kennel floor. He had kept his promise. Marin pressed the book to her chest and felt something crack in her heart, a fissure in the wall of hatred she had built against him, because this was not the act of a monster. This was the act of someone who understood what it meant to have something precious destroyed. She did not know that high in his tower, Riker stood at his window and felt the shift through the bond, felt her gratitude like warm honey spreading through his frozen veins, felt the first fragile thread of connection between them pull taut. He had told himself he did it to keep the peace, to prevent her from descending into despair. But it was a lie. He had done it because he could not bear the memory of her anguish when Seraphina had kicked that book across the floor. He had done it because for the first time in ages, someone else's pain mattered more than his own. The midwinter feast was 1 week away. The citadel buzzed with preparation like a disturbed hive. Lesser lords from across the northern Rockies territory were arriving daily, their banners flying from the towers, their retinues filling the guest quarters to capacity. It was the one time each year when Riker was forced to play the role of gracious host, to sit at the head of a table groaning with food and pretend he cared about the petty politics and posturing of his vassals. He hated it, but tradition demanded it, and tradition was the skeleton that held the pack together. Deep beneath the citadel, in a chamber carved from the mountain's bones, Elder Corvus met with 3 other members of the King's Council. They were old, all of them, their hair gray or white, their faces lined with decades of service. They had advised Riker's father and his father before him. They remembered when the young king had been strong and terrible, when his rage had been a weapon that kept their enemies at bay. And they had watched over long years as that rage had turned inward, as the king had locked himself away in a prison of guilt and ice. They had thought it the natural order of things. A king who needed no one, who wanted nothing, who ruled through fear and absolute authority. It was clean. It was predictable. It was safe. Until the girl. He has not attended a war council in 3 weeks, Corvus said, his voice gravelly with age. He was 70, but his eyes were sharp as a hunting hawk's. He spends his evenings staring out his window toward the kennels. Or he did before he moved her to the upper citadel. The shadow wolf has not killed in a month, another elder added. It lies peaceful as a house dog. The king walks the corridors, distracted, his mind elsewhere. This is not natural. She has poisoned him, the third said. The crippled girl. She has formed some dark bond with the royal soul wolf, and through it she is draining the king's strength. Corvus nodded slowly. Our enemies will notice. The Stonefang raiders have grown bold. Their ships harry our coastal villages with increasing frequency. They probe our defenses, testing for weakness. He leaned forward, his gnarled hands flat on the table. The king's power has always been his rage, his absolute ruthlessness. It is what keeps the lesser packs in line, what makes our enemies fear to strike. But the girl has stolen it. She has turned the shadow wolf into a pet, and in doing so, he has weakened the king himself. What would you have us do? One of the elders asked. She is under his protection. He has made that clear. Then we must make it equally clear that she is a threat to the pack itself. Corvus's eyes gleamed. The midwinter feast. All the lesser lords will be present. We will expose her before them all. Show them what she has done. Force the king to choose between this witch and his kingdom. And if he chooses her, Corvus's smile was cold and thin, then we will know for certain that she has enslaved him, and we will be justified in taking more direct action. For the good of the pack. The others nodded slowly. Plans were made. A scroll was prepared, covered in symbols that were ancient pack script prayers for protection and strength. It would be planted in Marin's room to be discovered during a routine inspection. Evidence of dark magic. Proof of witchcraft. Enough to damn her before the assembled lords. Corvus dismissed the others. Almost alone, Brenna Stone stood in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. You're certain this is necessary? She asked, her voice low. Are you having doubts, Brenna? Corvus's eyes were sharp. You came to me, remember. You said the girl was a witch, that she had enchanted the beast. Brenna's jaw tightened. I said she was unnatural, that her presence disturbs the order of things. And you were right. Corvus stood moving to her. The king is distracted, weakened. Our enemies grow bold. If we do nothing, the pack suffers. You understand this, don't you? Brenna was silent for a long moment. She thought of the king's cold rebuke of 50 years of service, dismissed because she had spoken truth about a crippled outsider. She thought of the way the Shadow Wolf now followed that girl like a dog of the whispers among the staff of the old order crumbling. What do you need from me? She asked quietly. Access to her chambers. And silence when the scroll is found. Brenna nodded once, sharp and bitter. For the good of the pack. For the good of the pack, Corvus echoed. When she left, Corvus sat alone in the chamber staring at the guttering candles. He told himself he was acting for the pack's survival, that he was protecting his king from a parasite. But deep down in a place he would not acknowledge, he simply could not accept that the king he had served for so long might want something other than cold, bitter solitude. That Riker Blackthorn might want to be happy. And Corvus would burn that possibility to ash before he allowed it to take root. The night before the feast, a servant brought Marin a message. The king requested her presence at the celebration. A dress would be provided. She would sit near the hearth away from the main table, but she would attend. It was not a request. It was a command. Marin's stomach knotted with dread. She had not been in a crowd since leaving her father's house. The thought of being stared at, whispered about, judged by dozens of strangers, made her want to crawl back down to the kennels and hide behind Noctis's bars. But she had no choice. That evening, there was a knock at her door. Marin called for whoever it was to enter, expecting another silent servant. Instead, a figure stepped into the room that made her breath catch. It was not a servant. It was him. Ryker Blackthorn stood in her doorway, filling the frame with his presence. He was tall, broader across the shoulders than she had remembered, his dark hair pulled back from a face that could have been carved from stone. His eyes, those burning gold eyes that she had seen only through the bond through Noctis, were fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel pinned. He said nothing for a long moment, just looked at her, sitting in her chair by the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale. Then he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Marin's heart hammered. She had never been alone with him. Had never heard his voice directed at her, except that once in the kennels when he had knelt beside her and promised to repair her book. He crossed the room and set something on the table, a small wooden box polished to a soft gleam. Open it, he said. His voice was deep, rough, like stone grinding against stone. Marin's hands shook as she reached for the box. Inside, nestled on black velvet, was a necklace. A simple chain of silver, holding a pendant, shaped like a compass, rose the kind sailors used to navigate by the stars. It was your mother's, Riker said. I had it retrieved from Thornfield Manor as part of your family's banishment settlement. It should have been yours. Marin stared at the necklace, her vision blurring. She remembered it. Her mother had worn it, always a gift from Marin's father in the early days of their marriage, before love had turned to disappointment and then to nothing. How did you, her voice broke. You spoke of her, in the kennels, to Noctis. Riker's jaw tightened. I hear everything he hears, feel everything he feels. The bond between us is absolute. Marin looked up at him, understanding dawning. You were there, all those times I thought we were alone. You were listening. Yes, well, then you know. Her voice was barely a whisper. You know what your household thinks of me, what they call me. I know. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. And tomorrow you will face worse. The lesser lords will be curious about you. They will whisper, they will judge. I cannot protect you from their words. Then why make me attend? Riker was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been pain. Because you should not hide. You have done nothing wrong, and I will not allow them to treat you as though you have. He reached down and picked up the necklace, the silver chain pooling in his large scarred hands. May I? Marin nodded, unable to speak. Riker moved behind her chair. His hands, so large and brutal, were impossibly gentle as he draped the chain around her neck and fastened the clasp. His fingers brushed the nape of her neck, and Marin felt a shock run through her, warm and electric. Through the bond. She could feel him. Not just his presence, but his emotions. Conflict, longing, fear, a desperate aching need warring with an iron determination to keep his distance. He stepped back quickly as though her skin had burned him. You should have something of your own tomorrow, he said, his voice carefully controlled, not borrowed, not given as charity, something that belongs to you by right. Maren touched the pendant, her fingers trembling. Thank you. Riker moved to the door, then paused with his hand on the latch. He did not turn around. The feast will be difficult, but you are stronger than they know, stronger than you know. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. I have seen it. Through him. Through Noctis. You have more courage in your body than most warriors have with all their strength. Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Maren sat alone in the firelight, her hand pressed to the compass, rose at her throat, and felt the last of her hatred for the king crumble into dust. He was not her enemy. He was as much a prisoner as she was, trapped by guilt and fear and the weight of long years of loneliness. And somehow, without meaning to, they had begun to save each other. The great hall of Stonehaven citadel had been transformed. Torches blazed in their sconces, casting dancing shadows on the volcanic stone walls. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, winter vegetables stored in the deep cellars, barrels of ale and wine. The air was thick with the smell of food and smoke, and the musk of too many bodies in too small a space. The lesser lords had come in their finest, their ladies draped in silk and velvet, despite the winter cold, their guards standing at attention along the walls. Banners hung from the rafters, each one representing a different packed territory within the Northern Rockies kingdom. At the head table on a throne of carved black wood sat Riker Blackthorn. He wore the formal regalia of his station, a surcoat of midnight blue embroidered with silver wolves, a heavy chain of office across his shoulders, his hair bound back with a silver circlet that was the closest thing he had to a crown. He looked every inch the king, cold, remote, untouchable. And at his feet, for the first time in memory, lay Noctis. The great black wolf had been brought up from the kennels under heavy guard, though the guards had quickly realized they were unnecessary. Noctis had followed Riker, calmly had taken his place beside the throne, without a growl or a snarl, and now lay with his massive head on his paws, his golden eyes surveying the hall, with an intelligence that made the assembled lords deeply uncomfortable. Whispers rippled through the crowd. The Shadow Wolf, the king's monster. Here, among them. Near the great hearth, far from the high table but still visible to all, Marin sat in her chair. She wore a gown that had been provided by Brenna, a simple dress of deep gray wool that was finer than anything she had ever owned. Her mother's necklace gleamed at her throat. Her dark hair had been brushed and left to fall in soft waves around her shoulders. She felt every eye in the room on her, felt the weight of their judgment, their curiosity, their contempt. But she kept her chin up and her hands steady in her lap, and she did not look away. The feast began. Riker gave the traditional welcome, his voice carrying across the hall with effortless authority. Toasts were drunk, food was served. The bard began to play, and the noise of conversation rose like a tide. Marin picked at the food a servant had brought her. She was not hungry. Her stomach was tied in knots, and the heat from the fire was making her lightheaded. She caught Riker's eyes once across the expanse of the hall. He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought she saw something in his gaze that might have been concern. Then someone spoke to him, and he turned away. Noctis, however, had not looked away. The great wolf's eyes were fixed on Marin, and his tail lying behind him gave one slow, deliberate thump against the stone floor. A gesture of recognition, of connection. Marin's heart squeezed. She wanted to go to him, to press her face into his fur and hide from all these staring eyes. But she was trapped here on display, a curiosity for the lords to examine and dismiss. The feast wore on. Hours passed. The hall grew warmer, the noise louder. Lords drank too much and grew boisterous. Ladies whispered behind their hands. And then, as the main courses were being cleared away, Elder Corvus rose from his seat at the high table. He was an imposing figure despite his age, his back straight, his voice strong. He raised his goblet, and the hall slowly fell silent. "A toast," he called out, "to our king and to the strength of his line." The hall erupted in cheers. Goblets were raised. Riker inclined his head in acknowledgement, his face expressionless. But Corvus was not finished. "We are a people of strength," he continued, his voice ringing out over the crowd. "Our power is in our blood, in our bodies, in the wolf that lives inside each of us. We do not suffer weakness. We do not tolerate corruption." A murmur ran through the hall. This was not a typical feast day speech. Riker's eyes narrowed. Noctis lifted his head, a low growl building in his chest. Corvus turned, and his gaze fixed on Marin like a hawk spotting prey. "And yet," he said, his voice heavy with disapproval, "a weakness has been allowed to fester in our very heart. A crippled girl, an outsider, a criminal sent here as punishment, has somehow formed a bond with the royal soul wolf." The hall went utterly silent. Every eye turned to Marin. She felt the weight of their stares like physical blows. This is not natural, Corvus continued. This is not a blessing. Her brokenness is a conduit for dark magic, a parasitic bond that is draining our king's power, leaving us vulnerable to our enemies. He reached into his robes and pulled out a scroll holding it high. Evidence was found in her chambers, symbols of forbidden magic, rituals of binding and control. Marin's blood turned to ice. She had never seen that scroll, had no idea what symbols it bore. This was a lie, a trap. She is not a companion to the Shadow Wolf, Corvus declared, his voice rising. She is its captor, and through it she has enslaved our king himself. The hall erupted, shouts of shock and anger. Lords rose to their feet. Ladies gasped and clutched at their companions. Riker stood, his face a mask of cold fury. This is a lie. But before he could say more, the great doors of the hall burst open with a crash that silenced the room. A guard stumbled, in his face pale, his armor spattered with blood. "Your Majesty," he gasped. "Ships in the bay. 50 vessels flying the banner of the Stonefang Raiders. They're attacking the lower docks." Chaos exploded through the hall. Lords shouted for their guards. Ladies screamed. The carefully ordered feast dissolved into panic, and Corvus seized his moment. "You see," he roared over the noise, "our enemies are at our gates. The king's power wanes, and they have come to test us." He pointed at Marin, his hands shaking with zealous fury. "The curse must be purged for the good of the pack." He drew a long ceremonial knife from his belt, its blade etched with ancient runes, and started toward Marin. Other council members moved to intercept Riker, their own weapons drawn. The lesser lords, caught between loyalty and panic, did not move to stop them. In their fear, they saw Marin as the source of their doom. Riker snarled a sound more wolf than man and threw the first elder aside with contemptuous ease. But 3 more blocked his path, and Stonefang warriors were already pouring through the doors, their axes wet with blood. The feast had become a battlefield, and Corvus was closing in on Marin, his knife raised, his eyes blazing with righteous conviction. "For the pack," he hissed, his hand closing around Marin's hair, yanking her head back. The blade came up, its edge catching the firelight. "For the old ways, for—" A black shape exploded from near the throne. Noctis moved like lightning, like a force of nature given form. He crossed the distance between the high table and the hearth in 3 enormous bounds and slammed into Corvus with the force of an avalanche. The elder went flying, crashing into a table that collapsed beneath him. The knife skittered across the floor. Noctis stood over Marin, his hackles raised, his fangs bared in a snarl that promised death. He was no longer the gentle creature who had listened to her stories. He was ages of rage made flesh, and his eyes promised that anyone who touched her would die screaming. But the danger was far from over. Stonefang warriors were flooding the hall now, their weapons seeking targets. The citadel guards were fighting back, but they were outnumbered and caught by surprise. Blood stained the stone floor. Bodies fell, and through the chaos Marin saw him. Garrick Ironclaw, the alpha of the Stonefang Raiders. He was massive, nearly 7 feet tall, his body covered in ritual scars and runic tattoos. His axe was the size of a small tree, its blade etched with more runes that pulsed with a sickly green light. He cut through the defenders like they were wheat, his eyes searching the room until they found what they sought. Riker Blackthorn. "There!" Garrick roared, his voice like thunder. "The great kill. Let's see how mighty you are without your monster to hide behind." He charged toward the high table, his warriors clearing a path before him. Riker met him halfway, his own greatsword appearing in his hands as if summoned. The 2 alphas collided with a crash of steel on steel that rang through the hall. They fought with brutal efficiency, each strike meant to kill. Riker was faster, more skilled, but Garrick was larger, stronger, and his axe hummed with dark magic that made each blow shake the stones beneath their feet. The battle raged around them. Noctis held his position over Marin, taking down any warrior foolish enough to approach. The lesser lords and their guards had joined the fight now, and the tide was slowly turning. But Garrick was pushing Riker back step by step, his axe battering against the king's sword with relentless force. And then Garrick saw her, saw Marin sitting in her chair behind the massive black wolf, saw the way Riker's eyes flickered toward her between strikes. Understanding dawned on his scarred face, and his grin turned savage. "The great Blackthorn," he sneered, "brought low by a broken pet." He feinted left, drawing Riker off balance, then pivoted with shocking speed and swung his axe in a wide arc, aimed not at the king but at Marin. "No!" The word was torn from Riker's throat. He moved faster than thought, throwing himself between Garrick and Marin. His sword came up to block, but the rune-etched axe was too powerful, too heavy, driven by all of Garrick's strength and fury. The blade sheared through the sword like it was made of paper and bit deep into Riker's shoulder and chest. The sound of rending flesh and breaking bone filled the hall. Riker staggered, his sword clattered from nerveless fingers. Blood bright and red spread across his chest in a flood. He fell to one knee, his hand pressed against the wound, his eyes already beginning to lose their golden light. No! Marin's scream cut through the chaos. Garrick raised his axe for the killing blow, triumph blazing in his eyes. But Noctis was already moving. The great wolf launched himself at Garrick with a snarl that shook the rafters, his jaws closing around the raider's arm. Garrick bellowed in pain and stumbled back, his axe swinging wild, giving Riker the precious seconds he needed. But they were not enough. The wound was too deep, too much blood. Marin dragged herself from her chair, her useless legs trailing behind her, pulling herself across the blood-slick floor with desperate strength. She reached Riker as he fell forward, catching his head in her lap, her hands pressing against the terrible wound in his chest. The battle still raged around them, but Marin's world had narrowed to the man dying in her arms. His eyes, those burning gold eyes, found hers. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth as he tried to speak. "I'm sorry," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I was a fool, wasted so much time in the cold." "Don't," Marin pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Don't talk. Save your strength. You'll be a no." His hand, shaking and weak, reached up to touch her face. His fingers were slick with his own blood. "Must say this, while I still can." His eyes, losing their light, held hers with desperate intensity. "It was never about the beast, never about Noctis. It was always about me. You didn't soothe him. You saved me." A shuddering breath, his hand cupped her cheek with heartbreaking gentleness. "I love you. I think I have from the moment I saw my monster wag its tail." Marin's heart shattered. This impossible man, this king who had been alone for so long, loved her. Had loved her perhaps from the beginning, and she had been too blind to see it. "I love you too," she whispered, the words torn from the deepest part of her soul. "I love you. Please, please don't leave me." His eyes softened. "Not worthless," he breathed. "Never worthless. You are everything." Then his eyes closed. His hand fell away from her face. His chest stilled. Riker Blackthorn, Alphaking of the Northern Rockies, was gone. The world stopped. Around them, the battle continued. Steel clashed. Men died. But Marin heard none of it. She felt only the terrible absence where his presence had been, the cold void where warmth had lived. No, the word was not spoken. It was felt. A primal refusal that rose from the core of her being, from a place deeper than thought, deeper than reason. "No, you will not I will not let you." Marin pressed her hands to his chest, to the terrible wound that had stolen him from her. She poured everything she had into him. Her love, her grief, her desperate, impossible will. And deep inside her, something responded. The bond, the invisible thread that had connected her to Noctis and through him to Riker. It was there, frayed and fading, about to snap as his life force guttered out like a dying candle. But it was still there. Marin grabbed hold of it with everything she had, wrapped her entire being around that fragile thread, and pulled. "You will not leave me," she screamed, her voice raw with power and anguish. "I will not allow it." And then something inside her broke. Or perhaps it unlocked. Energy surged through her body, a river of pure force that had always been there waiting. Not her power, their power. The bond between them, amplified by her love, transformed by her will. Her soul became a conduit. Silver light exploded from her hands, pouring into Riker's still body. It was not fire. It was not magic as the Council would understand it. It was life itself, pure and undiluted, flowing from her into him. The light grew brighter, more intense, until it filled the hall with a radiance that made the torches seem dim. A wave of energy burst outward from Marin and Riker, washing over the entire great hall in a tide of silver brilliance. Where it touched, the wounded flesh knit together. Broken bones reset themselves. Blood stopped flowing from open cuts. The dying gasped and set up their eyes wide with shock. But where it touched those with betrayal in their hearts, those who had conspired against their king, the light burned. Corvus and his co-conspirators screamed as their wolf marks seared with silver fire. The connection to their beast, the very thing that made them pack, was stripped away. They fell to their knees, reduced to human only. Omega. Powerless. The Stonefang warriors, untouched by the healing wave, cried out in terror. They saw Marin kneeling in a pool of silver light, saw the king's body beginning to glow with molten gold, and they knew they faced something beyond their understanding. Garrick Ironclaw stared, his face ashen. What are you? Ooh. But Marin did not answer. She had eyes only for Riker. The wound in his chest was closing, the flesh knitting together as she watched. The terrible pallor was leaving his face replaced by a flush of warmth. His chest still in lifeless moments before it began to rise and fall with shallow breaths. And then his eyes opened. They were not just gold anymore. They were solid, blazing gold, burning with a light that was ancient and absolute. The eyes of a king who had been broken and remade, who had touched death and returned, who had finally integrated all the fractured pieces of his soul into something whole. He rose in a single fluid motion, pulling Maren up with him. Her feet left the ground as he held her against his chest, his arms wrapped around her as though he would never let go. The silver light surrounding her pulsed. The gold light emanating from him flared in response. Where they touched, the energies merged, creating something that was neither one nor the other, but both a perfect union of two souls made one. Riker looked at her, his eyes soft with wonder and love, and then he turned to face the hall. His voice when he spoke was not loud, but it filled every corner of the great hall, resonated in every chest, commanded absolute attention. I am Riker Blackthorn, Alphaking of the Northern Rockies. He looked down at Marin, still held safe in his arms, and his expression transformed into something that no one in that hall had ever seen on their king's face. Tenderness, joy, love. And this, he said, his voice ringing with absolute conviction, is Maren Thornfield, my mate, my queen, my heart. Her eyes glowing with that steady silver light met his. And in that moment, bound together by more than just magic, more than just love, they were complete. Around them, the hall had fallen silent. The Stonefang warriors were on their knees, their weapons thrown down, their leader backing toward the door, with terror written across his face. The lesser lords stared in awe and fear. They had come to a feast. They had witnessed a resurrection. They had seen their king reborn, and a queen crowned in silver fire. Noctis, standing guard at their feet, lifted his massive head and let out a howl. It was not a sound of rage or grief. It was triumph. It was joy. It was the song of a soul finally made whole. And his tail, that powerful appendage that had known only stillness for so long, began to wag. A steady, happy rhythm that spoke of peace and home and love, long denied but finally impossibly found. The war was over before it truly began. The Stonefang warriors surrendered en masse, and Garrick Ironclaw was taken in chains. 3 days later, a trial was held in the main square of Stonehaven. The entire citadel turned out to witness justice. Corvus and his conspirators were brought forward in silver chains that prevented them from shifting. They stood before Riker's throne, stripped of their wolf marks, reduced to the very weakness they had despised. Witnesses testified. Guards spoke of the conspiracy. Servants confirmed the planted scroll. Brenna Stone, her face tight with shame, admitted her own complicity. I allowed prejudice to poison my judgment, she said, her voice shaking as she looked at Marin. The queen showed me mercy and compassion when I showed her only cruelty. I was wrong, and I beg her forgiveness. Marin, seated beside Riker on a throne that had been crafted for her in 3 days of furious work, inclined her head. Granted, we all carry prejudices. What matters is what we do when we see them for what they are. When it came time for Corvus to speak, the old elder stood straight despite his chains. I acted for the pack's strength, he said, defiant to the end. I saw the king weakened by this girl, and I sought to restore the old ways. I make no apologies. Marin felt the bond pulse within her, the silver light that had saved Riker still flowing through her veins like a second heartbeat. In the 3 days since the resurrection, she had discovered something extraordinary. The power that had knit his flesh together, that had stripped the conspirators of their wolves, had left a gift inside her. It would not last. She could feel it fading slowly like snow melting under spring sun. But for now, while the magic still thrived, she could stand. Not with her own strength, but with the strength of their bond, with Riker's power flowing through her as hers had flowed through him. She had told no one except Riker. This moment, this chance to address her accuser on her feet rather than from her chair, felt like grace. Marin rose from her throne. She moved with a grace that silenced the crowd, for she was not in her chair. She walked on legs that had never held her weight, supported not by her own muscles, but by the bond, by the silver light that flowed through her veins. You saw change as weakness, she said, her voice clear and strong. You believed that compassion was corruption, that love was a disease. But you were wrong, Elder Corvus. Love is not weakness. It is the foundation of true strength. And the old ways that you sought to preserve were nothing but fear dressed up as tradition. She turned to address the assembled crowd. A pack that cannot adapt dies. A pack that cannot feel becomes a pack of monsters. My king was never weak. He was wounded. And in helping him heal, I found my own healing. That is what love does. It does not diminish, it multiplies. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Riker stood and took Marin's hand. Together, they faced Corvus and his fellow conspirators. Your sentence, Riker said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, is banishment. You will be stripped of your pack affiliation and sent into the world as Omega. You will live as you forced others to live, powerless, outcast, reliant on the mercy of those you once judged. Perhaps in your exile, you will learn what you refuse to see here. That strength without compassion is merely cruelty, and cruelty is the truest weakness of all. The sentence was carried out. Corvus and the others were escorted beyond the pack's borders and released into the wilderness. They were given supplies and a chance at survival, which was more mercy than they had shown to others. As for Garrick Ironclaw, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, his sentence to be served in hard labor, rebuilding the docks and villages his raiders had destroyed. A fitting punishment for a man who had built his power on the suffering of others. The citadel slowly returned to normal. The lesser lords departed, carrying with them stories of the king who had died and been resurrected by his queen's love of silver light and golden fire, of a new era for the Northern Rockies pack. Winter deepened. Snow fell on the black stone of Stonehaven, softening its harsh edges, transforming it into something almost beautiful. And 6 months after the midwinter feast, as spring began to touch the forest below, with tentative green, Marin and Ryker sat in the winter garden that overlooked the Pacific. It was evening. The sun was setting over the water, painting the sky in shades of violet and rose and gold. The air smelled of pine and salt, and the rich, loamy scent of earth, waking from winter sleep. Riker sat on a stone bench, and Marin sat in his lap, her head resting against his chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. Her legs, no longer supported by the bond's magic, were tucked beside her, but she did not need them. Here in his arms, she was exactly where she belonged. At their feet, Noctis lay in the grass. His great head rested on Marin's knee, and his eyes were half closed in contentment. He was no longer the beast of the dungeons. He was simply Riker's soul made visible, finally at peace. Children's laughter drifted up from the lower courtyards. The citadel had changed in 6 months. It was still a fortress, still stern and strong, but it was no longer cold. Warmth had seeped into the stone, carried by a queen who ruled not with power but with compassion. Marin had become what the people called her, the heart of the pack. She advised Riker in matters of justice and policy. She mediated disputes. She listened to the grievances of the lowest servant with the same attention she gave to the highest lord. And slowly the pack had learned what their queen already knew, that true strength came not from domination, but from connection. Former enemies had begun seeking audience, drawn by tales of a pack that ruled with both strength and mercy. Trade had increased. Alliances had formed. The Northern Rockies pack was stronger than it had been in ages, and Riker was a different king. The cold tyrant was gone, replaced by a man who could laugh, who could feel, who could love without fear. The guilt of his past was still there, a scar on his soul, but it no longer defined him. Marin's love had shown him that redemption was possible, that long years of penance could finally blessedly end. "What are you thinking about?" Riker murmured, his lips brushing her hair. "The sea," Marin said softly. "I used to dream of sailing away on it, of finding a place where no one would look at me with pity or contempt. A place where I could be free." She tilted her head back, her silver eyes meeting his gold. A smile curved her lips, warm and radiant and full of joy. "But now I know I was never meant to sail away. I was meant to be an anchor, for you, for us, for this pack." Riker's arms tightened around her. He kissed her, then long and slow and deep, a kiss that tasted of salt and love and home, a kiss that promised tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, both smiling, Noctis shifted at their feet. The great black wolf let out a contented sigh that was almost human in its satisfaction. And then his tail, lying in the grass behind him, began to move. One solid thump against the earth, then another, a steady, happy rhythm, the heartbeat of a pack made whole, the song of a beast who had finally found peace, the sound of 3 souls once broken and alone, now bound together in a love that had conquered death itself. Marin laughed, the sound pure and joyful. Riker smiled, a true smile that transformed his face into something beautiful. And Noctis's tail kept wagging on as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and the first lights of evening flickered to life in the citadel below. They had been broken, they had been lost, they had been alone, but they were broken no longer. They were found. They were home, and the tail that had not wagged in 300 years would never be still again.